I'm Rusznyak, and I'm a teacher educator at Wits University. I'm the director of the LCT Hub. We have a program every week which we do learning LCT, and we really talk about how we use LCT both in our teaching, in our research, and in our practices. And so what I'm going to do today is just talk about some of the ways that we've used LCT to really rethink, change, and radically transform the way that we are preparing our students for reflecting in practice. So I'm going to introduce a knowledge building approach. And so this is how, this is the problem, basically. We have prompts that we ask our students to reflect on when they're in the classroom, when they're in the schools. And these are very similar to the kind of prompts that teacher educators use around the world. We've looked at many examples, and they basically go, how did your lesson go? What worked? What didn't go so well? What would you do differently next time? And our big concern is that we keep getting students who answer with responses like this one. You know, so today I taught a grade 10 class about perspective. I explained what that means. I showed them how to draw a perspective drawing, and many learners struggled with drawing it. One told me that they felt like giving up, but we carried on, the bell rang, and then I told them to finish it at home. And, you know, as many others have seen in their research, I know Steve Kirk's paper raises this issue as well. It's simply like a narrative account of what happened rather than meaningful, deep reflection. And so when we were going through the reflective journals and the reflective writing, we were finding about 30% of our students were actually just doing this narrative account. And we kept finding comments written by the supervising lecturers to say, probe deeper, probe deeper. It's good to see you writing it. This is the particular comment that was attached to this one. Gives me a sense of what you're doing, but try to reflect more deeply. And so in response, well, we then looked at what was the students doing, and they were writing more extensively. But actually, the complexity, the depth of their reflections was staying very much the same. So something had to change. And what we then did was we looked very carefully at what is going wrong. Why are, 70% of the students getting it, and the 30% are really not? And we started to use semantic dimension, and we actually looked at the questions in a group of colleagues and myself, and we said, you know what? Our questions are directing their attention entirely onto experience and feelings and their own thinking. And it's actually setting up a segmental learning where, you go to university and you learn about all sorts of things and theories, and you do work there, and then you go into this completely different environment in the classroom. And when you're in that environment, you don't need to think about what you've learned previously. The questions direct your attention on experiential stuff. And we were actually wondering then, is it that our reflection prompts are setting up this theory-practice divide, unintentionally? Is it actually entrenching the segmental learning? And so that's what I'm going to do, talk about today. And, what did we do about it, and why, and how did it pan out? So I would really very much appreciate comments and, input and sharing perspectives as we go along. So what am I going to do today? I'm first going to talk a little bit about the challenges of learning through experience and the ways that reflective practice has been set up in particular ways. Then I'm going to talk about how we've used LCT in action to try and prepare the students for reflective practice in a much more systematic, much more way that kind of brings the parts together. And then I'm going to wrap up and look at the potential that we have to think about reflection in a different way, instead of just, kind of making sense of your own feelings, as whether it could be a mechanism for doing some knowledge building work. So that's what I'm doing today. So we're going to start off with just having a look at some of the complexities of learning through experience. So this is the general literature on, or some of it at least, just a taste of the reflection literature. And a lot of it is, it's very personal. It gives the students a chance to articulate their experiential wisdom. It's personal writing. It focuses on their experiences. It focuses on their thoughts, on their feelings. And there's all kinds of models of how one can go through a reflecting in practice cycle. So, Gibbs has got a model, Kolb's has got a very influential model, but they all are about kind of having an experience, describing that experience, thinking about it, deciding on some sort of action, and then having the next experience. And through that, one is supposed to figure out how one works in practice and pretty much figure it out for yourself. That's all very well when you are already an established practitioner, you've already got criteria for what counts. But what about brand new people entering into a practice for the very first time, when actually they come in with a blank gaze, no kind of particular sense of what matters or what doesn't matter. And you kind of just put them into practice and say, well, tell us what happens, and think about what happens and what are you feeling. And I was suspecting that that was the reason why so many of our students, about 30%, were just kind of reciting, giving us a blow-by-blow account of their day or of their lesson or whatever, and not getting to that deeper stuff. So the problem for me was about this kind of segmenting, the theoretical compartment to the work-based learning. And the problem with a teacher education is that there are quite a lot of bodies of knowledge that the students have to master. And perhaps with other professional programs too, these are kind of packaged in courses, because each course, deals with a body of knowledge and needs to be understood in its own right. But there are very few opportunities for looking at the connection between all these different courses. So you've got this segmental curriculum that is made up of a whole lot of different courses. And then they go on work-based learning in the classroom, and lesson by lesson is more segmental learning. The concern that Carl raises is that when you have that segmented learning, it's very difficult to recognize or enact what is required. And so people then default to their common sense understanding. And Gary Hoban from Wollongong, in his book, said that a problem with teacher education, and perhaps very many other professional preparation programs too, is that you decide on, okay, what bodies of knowledge you need, you package them in courses, and then each course designer goes and designs their course in isolation. And so the students have all these boxes of knowledge, basically, but some of them make the links and see the connection, and others of them really don't. And then what happens to those, and how do we help them see the connections? How do we help them make the connections? That's really what the challenge is, because our policy here in South Africa says that, you know, things will just fuse together in the moments of practice, as if it's just a magic wand and it just happens naturally. And our research is showing that it actually doesn't. It doesn't happen naturally. Some students do make the connections, but it's really leaving it to chance. So I want to just talk a little bit about a particular approach, well, a particular challenge that is affecting teacher education programs, because I'm coming in with that as a starting point. Unlike engineers or dentists or lawyers, the students who are coming to be teachers have actually already spent more than a decade in a classroom situation, watching teachers at work every single day. In fact, some of them have been teaching their teddy bears and so on, and mimicking the actions of a teacher since they were little. And they come in with a real sense that I already know how to do this work. I know what there is to see. I just need the piece of paper to give me the license to go and practice. In the 1970s, Lorty made this observation that's been quite influential in teacher education, that it's all, there's a big difference between seeing the kind of the outer actions of teachers' work and the knowledge that they're drawing on, their intentions, their reasonings, and what they're doing and why. And that is not observable just by being a student in a classroom and watching somebody at work. So the challenge here for us is that classrooms are very familiar spaces, but what we're trying to do is to introduce the students to a new practice that they think they know, but actually we want them to have different ways of knowing and different ways of seeing and different ways of noticing what matters, so that when they go back into the classroom, they're seeing things in a different way. And Bourdieu was one of the ones, you know, who said that to do this, it needs a new gaze. And that's what I'm kind of working with here, is how do we get them to have this new gaze, and can reflections help in some way? So just to turn to LCT now, and looking at the idea of the gaze as a particular mode of recognizing and realizing what matters, what counts as authentic reality. And then Carl defines several gazes, and 3 of them are going to be relevant for this talk. So a blank gaze, where you're coming in kind of without any kind of specialized ways of seeing what matters. A cultivated gaze, where you've had prolonged interactions with significant others. And I've often wondered, well, that whether, you know, this long kind of what they've called apprenticeship of observation of teacher trainees in schools, watching teachers work for every day, if they've come in with a cultivated gaze. And the thing is, with every gaze, it reveals some things and it hides some things. So, you know, as Lorty said, you can see the routines, you can see the outer layers, but what you can't see is the knowledge and the reasoning behind that. And so the teacher education program that we work with tries to give them an additional way of seeing and noticing what matters, a trained gaze, through mastery of skills and knowledge. But the thing is that some people can have knowledge, they can have that, the skills, they can understand the concepts, but those concepts are really, are not recipes for practice. So their relevance just somehow, sometimes to some students, seems to be very arbitrary. And as Carl said, the concepts don't do anything by themselves. Basically, they can be totally inert until they're put into practice or recruited for a particular job or worked with by the people, the actors in the practice doing their work. So let's, that's what I'm trying to go on to, is how do we get this inert knowledge working, and how do we get the students to do the knowledge building work that they need to, of looking for ways that the parts come together in meaningful ways. So this was the challenge that that I kind of I have been working on. Is
Lee, can I just jump in here to say, please. People, if you want to ask a question, just jump in. Please interrupt Lee and jump in and ask her directly, because it's impossible for her to do this and read the chat at the same time. Also, it's much more fun to hear and see your voices.
Lee, is it okay if can I ask a question, Lee?
Sure, Lindy. Hi.
Hi, everybody. So Lee, I'm just going back to your last slide. So during studies, we want students to acquire a trained, and they'll keep developing that cultivated gaze throughout their career, right? Or am I wrong?
That's how I understand it. It's not that you just have one gaze. As far as I'm concerned, the way that I'm making sense of it is that they've come in with this cultivated gaze. They carry on cultivating the gaze when they're in the practice. But what we're doing is, sorry, Lindy, I think you might need to.
Lee, it's you.
Okay.
Try again. That's better.
All right.
There you go.
I'm still hearing an echo. I wonder if I shouldn't just run and get my headphones.
I'm not getting an echo.
Okay, all right, then I'll carry on. So Lindy, it's the way that I see it is we're giving an additional lens on top of their cultivated gaze, and they can recruit and move between gazes as they need to. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Lee. Thank you.
Quick question: can you go one slide back from this one, please? So here you talked about Bourdieu's new gaze, right? So how would then trainee teachers acquire this new gaze? Because if I understand Bourdieu's new gaze, it's really, as you define it, breaking from common sense experience. So by knowing what teachers, what decisions go into the actual performance in class, that's just getting new sensual experience, right? So how do you achieve this metanoia that Bourdieu called for?
So yeah, I think that the way that I'm understanding it is it's kind of breaking with the common sense, and you can do it through a very, very long apprenticeship. I mean, that could be one model. In knowledge building, Carl suggests that another way of of developing a gaze could be through training, you know, with new knowledge, new ways of thinking, new concepts that allow you to see things that you perhaps didn't see before. And so, you know, I'm suggesting that the training, or the teacher training that we do, is in an attempt to open up a new gaze, a new way of thinking about practice. Novalis, you know, I keep thinking back to that quote, you know, learning is about making the strange familiar and making the familiar strange. So for me, that's really relevant here, because they come in so convinced that they know how to teach. They know everything they know about teaching. They've been doing it for years. They've been mimicking it for years. But it's our job then to make it strange, to make something that they think is familiar and let them see it in different ways.
Lee, I'm being brave here and coming up with the absurd. And just the way you explained the trained and the cultivated gaze, again, I mean, we hear it, I've heard it so many times, but it's just struck something. And I'm wondering if by giving through the formal teacher education, by giving the students a trained gaze, it not only, I mean, it gives them the knowledge and skills, but those knowledge and skills give them the ability to recognize what counts as a significant other and what doesn't count as a significant other, including experiences, knowledge, skills. And that then through their initial teacher education years, the interactions with those significant others is quite prolonged, and they start to see, so their trained gaze maybe perhaps almost builds their cultivated gaze, makes it a bit more discretionary, like what counts, what doesn't count.
Maybe intentional.
Yes, yeah.
Intentional.
Maybe I'm stating the
So,
obvious, but that's just like,
okay.
I don't know.
So some interesting things there, Dale. I don't think it necessarily happens. I think it's there's a potential. There's a potential. You know, sometimes this knowledge is very latent and it stays latent, but it's got to be activated somehow. It's got to be brought to bear. So I think that it sets up conditions of possibility, but not necessarily realization.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it was, yeah, I think, you know, even John Dewey was in 1905 or something, made an argument that, you know, you can get immersed in practice and kind of pick up the techniques, or you can become a scholar of that practice and learn to think about it and to see kind of the mechanisms of it. And you might not become work ready quite as quickly, but once you're in the practice, you kind of pick up the technical things very, very much quicker. And then you do see more. Yeah. So I think it's kind of building on those ideas and really trying to get to grips with that.
Thanks.
Okay.
Could I just ask as well? So I'm just reflecting on my own experience, and the thing that allowed me to completely change the way I taught, so this is in a university context, was actually my first full year as a lecturer. I was teaching a relatively large class of kind of 120 or so of complete novices, and I'd come through a lecturing experience and expected to lecture, except lecturing didn't work, and I kind of realized, God, I've got to teach, not just lecture. And that came about from the first year I was doing a teaching course in parallel, but it was the massive failure. So I had a 70% fail rate on my kind of module. And I also had somebody to talk to, because every couple of weeks we were kind of having part-time sort of teacher training lessons. So for me, the thing that changed my gaze was massive failure, but in a supportive environment at the time. The other thing then over the years that changes it is kind of constant student feedback about what happens. So could you say something about, that's obviously not the way you want to have your gaze change.
No,
You'd
exactly.
like to get it right first time and then gradually improve things. So what other ways
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
change your gaze like that?
Absolutely. I mean, there's got to be some sort of impetus for, okay, hang on, this isn't working. Something's got to change. But the way that I feel that reflection has been set up, so you've got to go through that experience, potentially fail, and then like, okay, so that didn't work. Now let me try something else. And it's kind of sets up a trial, learning by trial and error, and making those mistakes, and then okay, so then we try something else, and it's a bit of a hit and miss affair. So what I'm trying to do here is, obviously with professional practices or teaching and so on, the hit and miss has real consequences for real people. And how do we make it more intentional, make it, set up a pathway towards success, so that it's not this, kind of throw yourself in the practice, try something, whatever you feel like, see if it works. If it doesn't, try something else, and so on. How do we set up a pathway to success? And that's what I'm trying to figure out, and also to show you what we've done and the impact it made. But absolutely, and that's what I think the problem with the way that reflection is understood, as just kind of the answers are within, dig within and come up with whatever you feel, and any option is okay. I kind of feel that it ignores the knowledge dimension. It's very, very focused on, a personalized, individualized journey, without looking at kind of patterns of practice that could actually lead people to success, and out of this kind of hit or miss way of working. So this was the challenge, is that we've got all these separate courses all over the place. They're kind of not hanging together. Some students are making the connection, others are not. But how do we potentially use work-based learning in a very, very different context, as a mechanism for not just looking at what's happening in the classroom and how you're feeling and what you're thinking, but actually keeping an eye on the theoretical lens as well, the train, and perhaps pulling in some of the ideas from the theory to make things work better, to make things a little bit more systematic, so that it's not that hit or miss. So I'm going to now go to the second part of the presentation, and basically looking at the nitty-gritties of what we did, why we did it, and the impact that it had. And to do this, I'm turning to legitimation code theory again, and I'm working with the semantics dimension, which gives us a way of thinking about how meaning shifts over text, over time, over tasks. And in this case, it's, in terms of writing reflections. And I'm particularly interested in how students shift weaken and strengthen semantic gravity, which is the degree of context dependence, which can be stronger or weaker along a continuum. So I'm trying to, what we tried to do was, we saw that there was a problem with our prompts that were asking the students. They were really focused on experiences and observations, and it was as if any kind of theory was irrelevant. It was a different environment. It was a different headspace. Don't go there. The two were segmented. So we changed our questions. And the first question we changed is, what concepts help me to understand the incidents, the successes, and the failures that occurred in the lessons that I observed and the lessons that I taught? So that's very much a, sorry, I'm just moving from what you've learned at university and bringing it into the classroom. But we felt that a one-way transfer was not enough. There's got to be, you know, strengthening of semantic gravity as well as weakening it. And so we also wanted to have what things from class, from your experience, can you take back to research? Can you ask theory? Can you question what you've learned? And so 3 of the questions that that we wrote, and we changed our prompts. The second one is, how is my knowledge of teaching and learning extended or challenged by what I'm seeing, what I'm experienced in the classroom? And that we thought was pretty, you know, you can challenge theory. You can say, hang on, something's happening here that I don't understand, that I don't know about. I need to find out more, and kind of start to prepare the students for that way of thinking that eventually takes them into perhaps seeing their classroom as a research space where they are interrogating their practices as teacher researchers. And then building on that, what aspects of teaching in this context or teaching with these learners or whatever requires me to do more reading, to have more conversations, to ask more questions, to discuss with others. In other words, to make it really, really clear that it's not just, you know, look within and find whatever you feel like work and do it and miss, but that these are challenges. We've got conceptual tools that we can use to make sense of things, but there are questions. There are things that can be challenged. There are things that you can learn more and look out for them. And we tried to just make sure that we kind of preempted them to know, to look for the connections. And that's published in our Walton and Rusznyak paper. So did they prompt deeper reflection? So we did a study. We had 576 Bachelor of Education studies in the cohort, and we worked with a sample of 33 who agreed to make their journals available to us to complete. Everybody completed the surveys, but those 33 did focus group discussions. Pam, yeah, you've got your hand up.
Yes, good morning, Lee. So I wanted to find out, you know, this connectivity between the theory and the practical that you spoke about in the earlier slides. How would that work if the work-based learning is not practical in the classroom, in a school environment, but more that happens during the theory lectures, for example, like the methodology or any of the other lectures where that theory that's being taught is becomes part of teaching experience, where they apply it in the class in terms of like a micro teach or have another
Okay, yeah, thanks, Pam. I like the work of Pam Grossman, who says that any kind of, kind of simulated teaching reduces the complexity. So the students then don't have to deal with everything, the full complexity of practice. So in a micro teaching situation, for example, they can focus on the knowledge building work, but they don't have to worry about managing kids and interruptions from the school and all kinds of other things. So she advocates learning to teach in a simulated or conditions of reduced complexity before you go into the real thing, but just as a kind of a way of finding your feet. But in terms of the semantic waves, I think things like that, the exercises that you do in the coursework and the micro teach and things like that, can start to help you shift or take you through those kind of pathways of going through the things in situations of lower complexity, but you eventually need to be able to get the students into them and help them to figure out, make sense of that complexity. So it's a kind of a scaffold towards the immersion in practice. And I think Karen Wolf has done some amazing work about engineering, about how coursework can start to scaffold that, those links between pure theory ideas and practice-based learning. So this was our study, and we looked at their reflective journals. And I'm going to just take one student and show a little bit of what we found with him. So to do that, again, I just want to show you how we coded the data. We're looking at the semantics plane, and we're looking at 4 levels of different strengths of semantic gravity and 4 levels of different strength of semantic density. So when we're looking at semantic gravity, we're looking at strengths of context dependence. And the way that we defined our 4 levels was at the strongest, the most context dependent, we said they're talking about specific events, specific actions, specific interactions, and that we coded SG++. And then weakening a little bit, general classroom observations. So, the learners were well behaved, or my explanations were good. Those are not specific, so we coded those as SG+, but they are still focused in the lesson. And then the weaker forms of semantic gravity would be where perspectives are beyond the lessons. So we coded the SG- tips, techniques, actions for practice, and SG- the most, the least connected to context would be principles of practice. So I've just shown you the translation device and how we've indicated that on the plane. And then if we look at the complexity of what the students write, this as operationalized by semantic density. So we go from very much simpler to more complex. And the simplest manifestation in our data set was separated, discrete, and descriptive. Then a little bit more complex would be discrete. You're only dealing with one aspect of practice, but it's an explanatory prompt. And then we thought that the relationality was how complexity was manifesting in this data set. So again, where it's relational, I see a link between this and that, but I'm describing it. We called that descriptive, and we coded it SD+. And when it was explanatory, we coded it as the most complex SD++. So that just gives you a sense of how we're going to track movements across the semantic plane.
When you do that that SD one in future, can you really split it, because it just does my head in seeing the weakest at the top?
Okay, sure.
Because our brains will naturally go from the bottom being simple to the complex being at the top. But it makes perfect sense to me. It's like discrete. That reaches back to, was it Pavel's question earlier on? Is it Pavel, by the way? I don't know. I don't think I've heard.
Yeah,
Is it Pavel?
Yes, it is.
Is that how you say it?
Yes.
Okay, great. Pavel. Yeah, Pavel's question earlier on about metanoia and a new case. It's like you're talking there about that, really, which is the difference between the kind of substantialist or discrete kind of concrete entities, separate things, and then the relational is a bit more kind of, bringing things together and so on. That makes sense. And then the descriptive and explanatory difference also makes great sense. And I can see the kind of things that you were saying that they didn't reach. And that would be things like, relational explanatory, or even perhaps discrete explanatory. I don't know. Where did they reach up to? Sorry, it really is hard to see that. I want to see it upside down.
Okay. All right. So, and then for analytical, the different spaces that we can talk about, that are defined by their strengths of their strengths of semantic gravity and strengths of semantic density. Rarefied.
I do, by the way, encourage everyone just to jump in and ask their questions rather than put it in chat. But I'm just going to jump in for Paul in this occasion, because he asked a really great question, which is about technical versus lay language. I'm not exactly sure what you were getting at, Paul, but it's a really awesome issue.
I mean, if you go back to the previous slide with the questions, your change questions on. So my immediate reaction reading the new questions versus the original questions is the original questions I kind of completely understand, they're in lay language. The new questions, I've got lots of long words and feel much more technical somehow. And maybe this is starting with just the fact that concepts is the second word in it. And I just wondered when I was looking at that as a teacher, whether the questions would almost immediately freak me, and whether that's something that helps. I mean, my immediate thing is I have to read those questions several times to make sure I understand what on earth am I being asked now, whereas the original questions, I know exactly what I'm being asked. So the immediate thing I was wondering is it the fact that they are kind of much more technical questions forcing people to reflect, or would it be possible to write these questions in a simpler way with shorter words, simpler language, and that still help?
Thanks, Paul. I think that's a really useful thing. I mean, I think that the first bullet, for example, what ideas have I learned that helps me to understand what happened in the lesson? Would be,
help me understand the things that went badly and the things that went correctly. But I don't know. Yeah. So what I was immediately wondering is if that just takes people back, if the fact that you're using technical language forces them to sort of think back into the world of the theory, because all the theory they've been learning has been probably bombarding them with new technical language.
That's a really an interesting point. So I think I want to just make a connection between what Pam was talking about and what you're suggesting here. So we don't introduce this to first year students. We introduce these to second year students when they've already had a full year of kind of thinking about their understanding of teaching and learning a couple of concepts and learning some of the theory. And and the first year is very much about kind of taking them step by step into that complexity, and starting with very, very much reduced levels of complexity, and then eventually getting more and more complex as the year goes on. But yeah, I suppose if you threw these at, you know, a first year student right at the beginning, they would freak. But yeah, make a really good point. Maybe we could introduce it earlier, but with a simpler language.
I just wondered if it would just be the sort of thing that would make a good experiment if you change the language of the questions, but the sense is exactly the same. Whether you did the same study as you're just doing, whether you would see any difference or not.
It's an interesting point. Think about that some more. Thank you. Okay, so this is one of the students that was in our case study, and I looked through his whole journal, and this was the most complex that I found with the old prompts. Most of them, in fact, it was the only one that left the prosaic code. So all of his reflections stayed in that bottom left quadrant, you know, and this is very typical. The first three are very typical of what he said, but this was the only time that he kind of abstracted a little bit. So, you know, the supervising teacher wasn't at school. I reported to the deputy principal. I was happy to face the class all by myself. There were challenges in the middle. Those challenges are not specified. They're not thought through deeper. There were challenges. Some lessons are more enjoyable because I taught them last year. And then this is the only time that he made some sort of, you know, he weakens semantic gravity a bit. It's easiest to manage a class if you're confident in your content knowledge. And that we thought that does make a connection between managing a class and being, and teachers' content knowledge, so that it's relational, but it's quite a simple statement. So with the new
a quick question, a quick question. These 4 examples, are they exact positions or are they relative positions in the quadrants? As in exact, as in quantifiable, and thus you arrived at the exact position of 1, 2, 3,
okay,
4.
So I used the translation device. So this I thought was discrete, it was descriptive, and it was a specific action. This one over here was discrete, descriptive, but it was more general. So I used the translation device to plot these positions.
Okay.
I don't know if that makes, if that's answering your question.
Yeah, kind of, yes. Okay.
Okay.
Did you ask that question, Pavel, because the numbers aren't exactly in the center of those squares, or some other?
So I was just wondering whether for each axis, whether you had numerical values, which would then give you precise position within a quadrant.
Oh yeah, no, these not doing that level.
No,
Okay.
no.
Don't need to.
We
only need to divide up
16
sorry,
spaces.
Susie.
Sorry.
Go
Sorry,
for it.
Nicole. I've defined 16, you know, spaces, and so you know, this is all analytically governed by SG plus, SD minus.
Yeah.
And a general comment on classroom management that is descriptive and discrete.
Right. Okay.
Okay, so it's more quantitative. Okay, but these are this was one of his reflections on a day. In response to the new prompts, we see substantially more movement shifting across the semantic plane. And he actually, it was actually interesting to see, because he had this formula. Every single reflection, he did this very, very intentionally. You know, he started off with some sort of abstracted, generalized statement. Then he went into a specific of what happened in the classroom, and then he tried to theorize it and make meaning of it. In some ways, it felt a little bit mechanical, but actually, it set up pathways for him to move around the semantic plane in quite a much more sophisticated way than he had been doing previously. And by the end of a 6-week period, the reflections were a little bit more natural, and they weren't taking this very, very formulaic pattern as they were in the beginning. And so here he's talking about the importance of noticing misunderstandings, and that there was this misunderstanding that happened in his lesson, and had he not picked it up, it would have been a problem. And this has serious implications for the teaching process. And point number 5 is actually quite interesting, because there he moves right into the worldly code, as far as I could see with the translation device, where he starts to take pedagogic responsibility for what's going wrong in the lesson, you know, and says, I'm seeing that all these students are getting the answers wrong. What am I doing about it? This was my mistake. And he's starting to think about the explanation for why their learning wasn't proceeding as intended. And then going back to okay, what am I going to do going forward? So we thought a really, really much more sophisticated pathway. But he was very, very intentional of answering those questions, or looking for going deeper. But he had a sense now of what going deeper meant. But not all students did. So out of our case study, we saw more complex pathways on 22 of the 33 students. 2 of the students simply did as they always did, you know, blow by blow account of the lesson. And then at the end, they would tack on something like, during this lesson, we were reminded of Vygotsky's concept of the ZPD or something, but not working with it, not using it to generate any new insights. It was just kind of tacked on at the end. So 2 of the students did that. One of them clearly misunderstood whatever theoretical concept he was working with, and so it was completely off the mark. And 7 of them were unchanged. So that was worrying, because we were really trying to say, okay, so how do we make sure that every student, you know, kind of gets taken through a process, not just left hit and miss. The changing the prompts did make a difference, but not to everybody. So we were left with thinking, okay, so now what? And this is where we then turned again to LCT, and there's been a lot of work done on using semantic waves in reflections. And, you know, so I know that there's been a lot of studies over a lot of different fields, and we went and had a look at those. And we decided what we were going to try and do now is set up a research project for students when they were in their final year of study. They've gone through the training process, they've got concepts, maybe they're activated, maybe they're not. But what about if we ask them in their final year as a compulsory project that everybody does, to analyze their own reflections that they wrote in the previous years when they were junior students. Would they see for themselves what they were doing, what they weren't doing? And would they be able to now, with the theoretical knowledge and the classroom-based experience that they have, would they be able to see how they could have written those reflections better? And we did this just before they did their final practicum, just prior to qualifying. So we did this research project before they went for their very final teaching practicum.
Can I just either make a comment, ask a question, but did you in any way semantic wave the questions? Because random thought, I mean, just I'm carrying on from what I was thinking before, but you could give examples with the questions as sort of prompts. So effectively semantic wave the questions rather than just here's the question, is the theory. If you say, here's the question, and then give an example answer that's the kind of answer that you actually want, so that they understand from the outset. So I just wondered, did you do any kind of teaching them what you were after with these questions, or was you just give them the questions and see what happened?
I'll show you what we've done, but I want, let me bring in a little bit of detail here, Paul. There were we gave them a 3-part assignment. And that was really taking them on a U-shaped semantic wave. And the first part was a theoretical question about what is the importance, what is the relevant, what is the significance of reflecting, why do we even do it? Okay, so that was a theoretical question at a high point on the semantic profile. Then we asked them to go and analyze their own answers. And then we asked them to, what could they learn from their analysis that would help them to strengthen their reflections in the upcoming prac? So we actually did show them that we wanted them to write their essay as a semantic wave. We showed them that.
So I was just wondering, I wasn't sort of thinking about this. I was thinking about in the previous study. So yes, were they just given the questions in the previous study, or did you give them any indication as to what you wanted them to write?
Oh, sorry. In the previous, no, I did. When we released these new questions, I did a workshop, a 2-hour workshop with the students, in which we looked at the semantic waves. We looked at, working between what you've learned at university and what you're experiencing in the classroom. We looked at examples of students who had done this in particular ways. So, sorry, it was modeled.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
So sorry, so I was interrupting.
No. Thanks, Paul. All right, so preparing the students for this self-study research project that we're giving to the students, we explained to them, what a semantic flatline was, and that reflections shouldn't be written as a semantic flatline, because it's kind of just then a narrative report. And we gave them examples. And so this was one of the examples that we gave of, so here I'm only looking at weakening and strengthening of semantic gravity. And I'm using the same levels, the specific, the general, the techniques and tips and the principles. And we gave them this example. This lesson is about peer pressure and how learners' peers can influence them to do something good or bad. The lesson focuses on reading. Learners underline the important words. Learners answer questions asked by the teacher. They answer the questions to gain better understanding. and the teacher checks up on each group. And we showed them that the semantic wave stayed pretty low over the reflection and didn't get to the kind of the levels of complexity, the levels of principled thinking that we're inviting them to think about. So again, we drew on the work of others who've used semantic waves to look at reflection, and we set up possibilities for them. You know, you could structure one of many options is to structure semantic waves like this, where you start by describing something that happened, you interpret it theoretically, you draw out your insights, and then you think about the implications going forward. So again, we gave them an example of a reflection that we had found from the first study of a student who took that kind of semantic wave. I think my maths lessons was well prepared, explanations were clear, but the activity was slightly difficult. I think my scaffolding wasn't enough. And then she goes into a kind of a more of an abstracted sense. If sufficient scaffolding was provided, then most learners would have been able to solve the problems, which they didn't do. And then she draws on a principle. Insufficient scaffolding constrains epistemological access. So that's really very much drawing on kind of what they had learned about in some of their education theory courses. In fact, two different courses. There was one course in first year on scaffolding and theories of learning, and in their third year, they were looking at factors that enable or constrain epistemological access, and that was in an inclusive education course. So she was bringing those together and drawing a principle together. And then she said, well, I'm not going to be discouraged. I'm going to do things differently, but she doesn't specify what that was. But we see more of a semantic range in this reflection than in the other. We showed them that there are other ways of writing, their reflections. You could start with a concept, look at its implication, look at what's happening specifically, and then draw out the insights. So, we set up, we did this in lectures, we did this in tutorial tasks with examples, with models before they went into their research project. And so as I said, the first part of the research project was a theoretical question on why reflect in the first place. And then this was the second part. Choose an interesting entry that you wrote in your reflective journals in previous years. Type it out, code it. We'd done the translation device, and draw its semantic profile. And this was, I've taken one of the students just to show you what he did. So he's talking about a lesson, and he divides it into the sections as we taught them, and he coded each of the lesson. And what is interesting here is, I did this. In level C, he goes, I use the task as an informal assessment. I need to think more carefully about different approaches to get everybody participating. Because why? Because in the report back, things got chaotic when some groups were reporting other students weren't listening. So that's a bit kind of more general. And then he went back to very specifics. I moved around to check on their process. So this was one of the reflections that he had written in his previous years in the classroom. And now he was, with all the other students, was analyzing it. And then we asked them, well, what do you see in your semantic wave, and what could you do better? And then this is his response. So he notices that his reflection ranges between levels 1, 2, and 3, but never reaches the 4th level, the level of principled. And he noticed that how much of it had was grounded in the observable teaching experiences, such as, you know, revising previous work, dividing learners into groups, and not much was in terms of the interpretation. And then going forward, what would you do differently? And here he said, well, I see for myself that I was writing narrative accounts of the practice. I can see opportunities where I could have weakened semantic gravity, like, for example, when I was talking about the learners who lacked motivation. He didn't actually elaborate on what he could have said, but he picked out some place where he could have probed a little bit more deeper. And then, you know, he obviously, this is a 3-page essay, and I've only taken, you know, little extracts from it, but it gives you a sense of the kind of the things that they were writing about. And in the end, he said, well, I need my reflections to be more personal, contextually bound, more complex, and so on. Identify incidents worthy of deeper consideration. This was just his conclusion, but he went into quite a nuanced discussion of what he had done and what he hadn't done. And what we thought we saw in here is how doing this task opens up possibilities for them to imagine what they could have done and how they could have done it better. And it wasn't just kind of showing them examples. The fact that they were able to go and see this enacted in their own reflections, and how perhaps now, towards the end of their study, they've got more of a sense of that trained gaze than they did back then, and can possibly see things more deeply in more complex ways. But we wanted this to really invite them to interrogate their practice, to think about how they could strengthen it, but also to open up the classroom as a research space for them to interrogate their practice. And just incidentally, there is a student, and I know Pam's here, Pam's supervising that student, who took this assignment that he did last year, and he's now doing a full honors research project, extending it. So, you know, it also is a kind of a step into just familiarizing them with research processes, and perhaps opening up possibilities for postgrad research. So we haven't done a systematic analysis of whether or not, after doing this, their reflections on teaching experience, their practicum, were deeper. We haven't done that. Anecdotally, lecturers are saying that they saw a difference, but we haven't analyzed it yet properly. And then just going on to reflecting as a mechanism for knowledge building. So not just kind of the hit and miss, figure it out for yourself kind of way, is, you know, what's the potential? And I want to go back and just talk about the problems with that segmented learning that I picked up on, and then sort of see how students recruited or worked with different aspects. So this one, for example, works with the work-based learning, the contextual realities of the school, and her insights from a course on educational law, policy, and educational rights, where she says the material of the conditions of the school are dismal. The toilets were inadequate, the classroom was under a tree. How does one expect kids to learn in these conditions? They get distracted. And in an ideal world, every child has the right to formal and education in a safe environment, but this is not happening in this school. And so what we just see here is pulling together of different, very, very different parts of the coursework, but coming together in a reflection. Just one more example. And this goes back to the example that I referred to earlier, the one about insufficient scaffolding. She was drawing together, based on work-based learning, drawing on her subject knowledge, drawing on her pedagogy, and drawing on the learning theory that she had learned in first year, which was that Bruner's idea of scaffolding. I think that the activity was slightly difficult, might be alluding to the ZPDs, the Zone of Proximal Development of Vygotsky. I'm not sure because it's not stated specifically, but it's implied. And then she draws on the inclusive education course, where they learnt about the difference between formal access and epistemological access. Formal access is kind of just being in the school space, and epistemological access, being able to acquire the knowledge goods that are on offer. But what we're seeing here is this bringing together of very different parts of the program. And so in conclusion, and I think that this connects with something that Paul raised earlier on, when reflecting on practice is understood as dig within and figure it out for yourself, it assumes that there's already a gaze in place that allows one to select what is relevant and make meaning of it. But for beginners who are just starting out, who have really no sense of the practice, it forces them into this trial and error, hit or miss approach to learning through experience. And potentially it keeps learning segmented. So thinking about reflective practice in a way of, can it be a mechanism by which we encourage the students to look for connections and make those connections? Careful pedagogic work is required. Just putting them in schools and say, figure it out yourself, it doesn't necessarily happen. It can happen. We saw that it happened for, 70% of our students. But there were those that really, they saw no links between what they were learning at university and how they were making sense of their practice. You need a curriculum that offers powerful theoretical tools. The students have got to understand them in order to recruit them. And what I think is that the teacher education curriculum is segmental. There's very, very vastly different bodies of knowledge. And actually, I don't think that there can be coherence when your bodies of knowledge are so disparate. But perhaps this is a way of getting some kind of coherence, building coherence through the knowledge building approach. That cumulative learning of pulling together the parts to see, to make sense of the practice. And yeah, the LCT tools and concepts were really useful for us as a team who was trying to grapple with this problem and figure out, how do we do things better? How do we do things that it's not just hit and miss? It's been useful for the tutors to have a language of practice. Before, they were just saying, reflect more deeply. But we've been able to give them some real tools about what more deeply could look like. And there's a shared language now between the tutors and the students and for students to make the rules of the game more explicit to them, you know, to kind of alert them to the fact that they could be and they should be thinking about these connections. Yeah, so that's what we've done. We don't think that the work's ended. I think that there's opportunities for us to think about how do we use autonomy, for example? How do we use constellation analysis to think about this a little bit more deeply? Especially what is target and non-target in terms of the object of reflection. So, you know, I don't think the work is done. It's certainly, it's a journey. It's a journey. And yeah, so those are some of the references that I've used. And yeah, so
Thanks,
that's
Lee.
what I've got to say.
Anybody can come in at any time and just ask anything or make any comments or whatever. Please do.
Lee, I have a quick question.
Steve.
Thank you, by the way. That was the best way to start my day. I'm actually doing a session tomorrow for a group of business people that are coming into the university and doing a non-credit bearing course, and they've asked for an introduction to reflective writing, and I've been so busy that my head's really not been in the space. So this has been a lovely kind of reintroduction into really useful ways of thinking. So I think my session will no doubt be better tomorrow as a result of getting up early this morning. So thank you so much for the inspiration. My first question was in one of your final slides, when you give the example, so it's your final semantic profile diagram, and you give the example of the
This one?
No, later, it was right towards the end, when you suggest that the student is evidencing those different levels. Yeah, a bit.
This is the student who did their own work. This was his analysis of his own writing. Is that?
Yeah, no, it was hang on, it was a slightly later slide. I think. When you gave us the, oh, so no, sorry, it was one of your the looking for connections slides, the example with the maths lesson.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So my question there was those extracts from the student writing, is that all there was? Like, is that the extract, or are those highlights from the writing? The reason I'm asking is because on their own, so I see this sometimes in student reflective writing, where students bring in theory, so they bring in terminology like scaffolding and epistemological access, but then there's no unpacking of that, there's no exemplification of that, and so it feels potentially quite performative. So they know what they need to integrate into the reflective writing, but they don't demonstrate that they know what they're talking about. And so on the surface, what you have there looks like a kind of, so in terms of your earlier pathways, you have students that start off in prosaic and then they end up in worldly, where they've taken the theory and they've actually applied it to a real world context. And then they're thinking about change of practice in their contexts, right? So they're in the worldly code. And I just wondered whether this was an example of rarefied code, where the students are using the concepts, but they're not demonstrating that they understand what those are or how those are applied. And I didn't know whether that was a fair analysis, or whether you simply had presented these as highlights and we didn't have the elaboration.
So yeah, what I've presented are kind of episodes of reflection. So, you know, that they're talking about one thing, and then they move on to something else, and then they move on to something else. So some of them are more elaborated, some of them are less elaborated, some of them are just drawing on the technical terms to kind of describe what they see or what's happening. So yeah.
So is
definitely
this example the sort of, is that
an episode.
a section of continuous writing?
Yeah, yeah.
It is. So that's so it,
So
you could
this is
argue that
one
that
of,
was,
yeah, this
yeah.
is they're encouraged to write every day in their journals. And so, you know, it's 6 weeks of writing. This was one focused part of the writing of one day. But she didn't say anything more about scaffolding, and she didn't say anything more about epistemological access. She kind of used the words there, and then they moved on. But this is different to somebody who just kind of tacked them on at the end, I thought, without, you know, this person has actually kind of put them in context and used them to describe her, you know, what she did or what she didn't do. But yeah, certainly they could have been more explicated, definitely.
Perhaps a question that's somewhat related to what Steve has just asked is, I mean, these are reflective journals, and so students, question is whether students kind of knew or whether they were expected to exemplify, say, epistemological access, or whether because they were journals and they thought that the point was to reflect on their practice, whether it was enough for them to make this note. They thought, okay, I know what it means. I don't have to explain that. I know it will be read by these researchers, but I'm not going to get a grade, which is different from writing a paper that they'll submit.
I think that's a very, very important point, Pavel, and definitely on. And they're also writing in their second, you know, in an additional language. So, you know, one of the things that we've also thought about is, you know, what's the potential of reflecting on voice notes where they don't have to write, or reflecting in their own language, for example. But yeah, they are, the journals are intended as a private conversation between the student and the lecturer who is supervising them in the prac. So the reflections are there, and the lecturers look at them, and then the lecturers can certainly invite them to a discussion. You know, they do sit with them and have a discussion about what, you know, what's happened, what they've learned. So it's part of a parcel. It's not the only thing. And reflections on their own is not I'm not saying it's a silver bullet, not at all, but it's one of many ways that I think that we can start to design a pathway of learning that doesn't just rely on a hit and miss.
Can I ask another question, Lee? Just as a matter of interest, one of the things that I've always grappled with, and I've only really made sort of hit and miss attempts and don't feel that I've succeeded. But in terms of semantic density, did you only use SD as a backstage analytic tool, or did you bring notions of discreteness, notions of relationality in any way front stage to working with students as well?
Last year, when we did this for the first time, we used semantic density and semantic gravity together.
With the students?
With the students. This year, we decided to just let them focus on this, on the strengthening and weakening of semantic gravity only.
So how did you pedagogize things? Did you use the plane? Did you kind of translate the meta language into simpler things?
Yeah. So they've been working with semantics, you know, since they were in first year, because I mean, we even set, you know, in first year we set up, for example, looking at the semantic waves in a reading. You know, look here, the lecture, the author is giving an example, now she's bringing out some theory and so on. So we do it very explicitly. even in their first year, when they're giving an assignment, we say, right, look, the structure of your semantic wave needs to be like this. The structure of your essay, the semantic profile of your essay needs to have this. You know, this is the theory part, this is the practice part, and so on. They work with semantic waves as a logic for sequencing their lesson steps. So they've worked with semantic waves several times in their B.Ed.
Yeah, I suppose so. If when things work in a sort of cumulative sense, so when you've got the inverse relationship between SG and SD, so when one goes up, the other one goes down, it's easy to use waves. But in the kinds of examples that we've looked at here, where you might have worldly code or you might have rarefied, you don't necessarily have SG and SD moving in inverse relations. So you would have to separate them out and do something other than the waves. So I was just interested whether you'd done that. I've sort of had goes at doing cluster diagrams and constellation type diagrams to show students how ideas are being connected together, but I've done that separately from using the waves, for example. And I found this really useful for seeing how you've done things on the plane. Just got me thinking about SD again for students and how we might do that sort of separately from the waves.
Lee, I had a thought that probably it's definitely beyond what you were talking about today, but as you know, there's a lot of research on how teachers, in-service teachers who are hosting student teachers, really downplay the role of education theory, you know, and will explicitly say, oh, please, when you get into the classroom, none of that matters. And sometimes even like make it this, like they seriously strengthen the dichotomy between theory and practice. And I'm just wondering how possibly, you know, here you're doing such intentional work to strengthen, to break that binary. Yet when they're in the site of practice, often the binary is reinforced. And how are we gonna reconcile that? Which is obviously a discussion for a whole other day, but it's just something that's going through my mind.
So thanks, Dale. One of the things that I'm actually working on at the moment, and we hope to have it published in March next year, is analyzing mentor conversations. So when the teachers in the schools have a student teacher, they watch their lessons, they give them feedback. We've got transcripts of those feedbacks, and we analyzing. Also, we're actually using the same translation device, the same semantic plane. We're looking at where the teachers are targeting their feedback, and the results so far, the results are very, very clearly that they've located mainly in the prosaic code with some shifts into the rarefied. Very, very few times that they go into stronger forms of semantic density. But there's some other findings there too that I'm not going to chat about now, but it's where their feedback is very general and very simple, it doesn't go anywhere. Where it's specific, it does a little bit more movement. So that's like kind of just the key finding of that analysis.
Well, we did. Oh, hang on. Thomas has a quick one, but then we will.
Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much for your talk. The reflection questions that you presented for your study made me think about possibly using that approach for some micro teaching that I do in teacher training. I started last semester, and I'll be doing it again next year. And I was wondering, for scaffolding micro-teaching itself, you mentioned Pam
Grossman.
Greenberg, I'm sorry?
Grossman.
Grossman, I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Are you familiar
2009
with-
reading.
Excuse me?
It's a 2009 reading. She looks at preparation programs of journalists, teachers, and religious leaders.
Okay, I just
And
found that. I just
how-
found that.
Okay.
Okay. Any suggestions on how one should, if others of us who do teacher training are curious and trying to, try out some of the findings that you've discerned, any suggestions for how we might want to go about doing that?
I've been writing up my my interventions and their findings and the kind of the tools that we've developed. So I've got quite a lot of papers published. But I suppose email me and see what you're interested in. But yeah, the work's ongoing. We're not there yet, but bit by bit.
Thanks so much, Lee. That was really, really interesting. And I think, really, I'm not going to try and summarize it all, but I never do. But I think it's really great to see work that's well theorized and has a practical implication. Not all work can, because sometimes one is like distance from a practical outcome, but it's always nice and satisfying when you can see the potential for change in agents' practices.